policing of the vigil at Clapham Common. Can I go to Simon Fell?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for joining us as well and for your time. I'd like to start with the policing plan for the vigil on the 13th of March. Could you describe how you factored in the gendered nature of this process into that plan? And I'm asking in particular because we've had quite a lot of evidence, both written and in the sessions that we held in person, where people spoke about a good number of male police officers joining the protest and trying to disperse the protests as well. So I'm interested in your view in that and why there were so many male officers there that evening.
Well, thank you very much. A couple of introductory comments about the vigil that you're referring to. Firstly, to say we were utterly outraged at the murder of Sarah Everard, and we recognised just how upset and angry so many people in London and well beyond were. My colleagues felt betrayed and appalled at what appeared as alleged to have happened. And I think if you look at our documentation, you can see that there was a real sense of the sensitivities that there would be in relation to this proposed vigil. You'll remember we were policing during the pandemic, Wave 2, Tier 4 regulations, and you'll be aware that those regulations had changed many, many times over the previous year, and sometimes had appeared to members of the public at least somewhat ambiguous. My officers had been wrestling throughout the year with events and protests and public order matters in those various different regulations. I think that, as the HMI report says, and I would commend it to you, we found ourselves in a very complex position and in some senses an invidious position that day. You'll be aware that we had been during, let's say, for this purpose, Tier 4, every day we had been dispersing events and or protests. We had been issuing tickets occasionally. More than occasionally, we'd made arrests. We'd had officers injured. Sadly, in upholding that law, in upholding those regulations in the pandemic, we had had to disperse people at funerals, at weddings, at wakes, at parties, and, as you know, a huge number of gatherings of various sorts, unlicensed music events, as an example. That very day, we attended 2 other vigils. One was of a murder victim, and we dispersed the people there after they had gathered and come together in a tight crowd for a protracted period. And another was in relation to a Tamil person who had died, where after the crowd would not disperse, we, having gone through our 3 E's, and indeed given some time before that dispersal, we had used enforcement action. I say all this because I want you to know that my officers take no pleasure in this. It is our job to uphold the law. It is our job to keep people safe. We were, and indeed are, in a pandemic at a very, very difficult time. We would much rather not be stopping people having their fun or expressing themselves or gathering for whatever purpose. But that was the job, to be able to uphold the regulations. And nobody wanted the outcome that we saw. I'm sure we will answer more questions about the vigil and the HMI report, no doubt. But in terms of the gendered nature, as you say, you may be aware that we had about 6 hours of people on Clapham Common that afternoon coming in ones and twos, small household groups, to lay flowers. And we had a very low-key police presence there. And those were mostly local neighbourhood officers. but there were a large number of women amongst them. And the officers who attended and dealt with what eventuated when the peaceful, respectful vigil turned into a very densely packed and large gathering, more like a protest rally than a vigil. Male and female have been commended in the HMI report for their thoughtfulness, their sensibleness, their proportionality, the way in which they took a very proportionate approach, the way they stayed very calm in the face of vile abuse, and their patience. Indeed, you'll be aware that the HMI looked at body-worn video extensively, and they described under really difficult circumstances exemplary conduct by the officers, and absolutely no evidence of heavy-handedness whatsoever, despite watching hours of body-worn video. But I personally did consider, and I know my Gold Commander did consider the day before, I did yesterday, the day before, I can't say when he did exactly, whether there was an argument for creating, it's been suggested since, hasn't it, that everything would be better and different if we'd had all-female police support units, as we call them, the public order trained officers. And two issues. One, not practical for us to do that, certainly at such short notice. And secondly, hugely divisive amongst my people, and I've subsequently taken a straw poll, and men and women alike are really not keen on this idea that when you have a primarily female rally or protest, that we will send only women in to deal with that. I know some people might wish to debate that, but what I can say is it was considered. It was not practical, and we didn't do it. It would be wrong to say that there was an unusual number of men there. Far from it. It was proportionate to our public order resources.
Thank you. The witnesses we had speak to us spoke about a point in the evening where the tone of the vigil shifted, and it went from being a peaceful protest, as you say, people going ones and twos, to a gathering crowd number where your officers then decided to take action. And the people who we spoke to who were stood on the bandstand couldn't identify what the motivating moment was for those officers to come forward and for that action to be taken. I'm interested in your view as to what that shift was and why they decided to take action at that point.
I'll bring Louisa in if that's all right, but just to save my voice. We're both equally well versed, but Louisa is the Assistant Commissioner for that bit of the business.
Thank you, Commissioner. So the HMIC took a detailed look at this point in particular, and they described officers for some 90 minutes patiently pleading with people who were on the bandstand chanting and refusing to leave. And the Gold Commander and the Silver Commander's log as to decisions made were very clear that there was a clear strategy of engaging and encouraging people to disperse. Some of that was successful. Certainly when the crowd gathered at just before 6 p.m. to nearly 1,500, quite tightly packed around the bandstand, a great number of people were receptive to police engagement and encouragement and did disperse, but there were a small number surrounded by still quite a large crowd on the bandstand who, despite nearly 90 minutes, as described by HMIC, of patiently pleading, did not. And therefore, it's quite clear when you look at the decision log of the commanders in charge of the event that the point was reached where the public could not be kept safe without officers actively removing those individuals.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I should say the report does make that absolutely clear. Last question for me then is around communications on the day itself. And the report does make clear that there were gaps between what the Silver Command knew and what the Gold Command knew, and the messages that were being passed backwards and forwards between them. So this was around the number of people in the event, whether there was a PA system or not on the bandstand. Those feel like essential pieces of information for you to know to be able to police effectively. So what lessons have you learned from this, and how will you be changing your practice as a result of it?
So we take all of that incredibly seriously, and as discussed previously on other matters with the committee, we do any HMIC report recommendation, we ensure that we address effectively, but in addition, we are holding a formal debrief of the vigil and the policing of the vigil with our teams to ensure that any point of learning is logged and that we take a very active approach to addressing it in our future operations. But HMIC were very clear in their assessment of this, that they identified a number of points of learning for us, but all of those in total were well within the bounds of what goes well or less well in any policing operation. So they certainly did not identify that those were matters that would have fundamentally changed the outcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Diane Abbott.